Hi, I'm Commissioner Ben Hovland with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission.
Hello, I'm Thomas Hicks with the United States Election Assistance Commission.
February is Black History Month. As part of the EAC's recognition of this month, we've been conducting interviews throughout February with Black election officials about their experiences in the field serving voters across the country. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Stephen Reed, the mayor of Montgomery, Alabama. Not only is Mr. Reed the first African-American mayor of Montgomery, Alabama, but he was previously elected as the first African-American probate judge in Montgomery County in 2012. Mayor Reed is also a former member of the Elections Infrastructure Government Coordinating Council and was previously a member of the EAC's Standards Board. Thank you, Mayor Reed, for joining us today. Just to kick things off, I'd hope that you could talk a little bit about your background and how you got to start in public service.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. My background is one that I was fortunate enough to grow up around public service. I was fortunate enough to grow up around, luminaries in the civil rights movement. And so this has always been a part of me, no matter how far away I tried to run from it. It's always been there. And I think when I came back to Montgomery after leaving corporate America and leaving some entrepreneurial endeavors, it was something that I got into because I wasn't satisfied with the level of progress that was being made here. And after President Obama's historic run for president in 2008, I was inspired to try to do more on my end, to be a part of that change that I thought we needed to make here. And so a few years later, I ran for a countywide probate judge seat here, and which happens to be our chief election official in each county in the state of Alabama. And I was fortunate enough to garner a lot of support from not only local, but state and national civil rights leaders who thought it was time that we had chief election officials in Montgomery who supported, easier access to voting, as well as some of the progress that they had marched for and tried to legislate before then. And so serving in that role for almost 7 years, I then decided to run for the mayor of the city of Montgomery because I felt like I could do more and I could influence outcomes in a more impactful way. And one of the analogies that I like to use is that I decided I wanted to be the thermostat instead of the thermometer. And I wanted to set the temperature as opposed to take it. And that's what we've been trying to do here for about the last 15 months.
That's great.
That's great. That's great. What obstacles have you faced during your career and how have you overcome them?
That's a great question. I think obstacles probably like, others have been there in terms of whether or not you feel like you're getting a fair shake in terms of displaying your potential and your talent. I think certainly there have been obstacles there that have been along the lines of whether or not a person thought I was ready for an opportunity when I certainly thought I was ready and had proven that in my work. And I think that when we look at how work is evaluated, whether it be on the corporate side or whether it be on the political side, sometimes that tends to be skewed. It tends to be skewed by race. It tends to be skewed by gender. And sometimes it's just skewed just by bad judgment. And so, having to deal with that has certainly presented some challenges, but I think I was able to overcome them due to a faith that I have, a spiritual foundation that I have that says to me that there are things that are beyond my vision and my recognition, that if I continue to keep my head down and work and stay true to my morals and beliefs, then I can achieve that. I also think I was able to do that because I had a great mentor or mentors, if you will, to kind of help guide me, to help me understand how to navigate some of those challenges and how to overcome them. And certainly, I think the support network that I have between friends and family, was priceless in some of the challenges that we had. On the political side, I think that, the challenges came down to, change and whether or not people believed in the change that was necessary. When we talk about changing the political process and trying to influence that, you run into a lot of resistance there. And it spans every demographic you can imagine. And I think often what we see is that people want to have change without the process of going through change. They want to have the benefits of that, but they often don't want to put in the hard work and the sacrifices that's necessary. And I like to say that for me, I'm one who's led by faith and not fear. And I think often fear wins in too many circumstances as opposed to faith and believing that we can accomplish things that have not been accomplished at that time. And so that's been some of the challenges, but those have also been some of the ways that I've tried to overcome them by leaning on my network and certainly leaning on my faith, and then putting the work in, and sometimes having to go it alone, even when you run into that headwind that may present itself.
That's great. Mayor Reed, the last trip I took really before the pandemic set in was to your city, was to Montgomery. And it was the first time I'd ever been there, and it was just really moved. I mean, it was such a great visit and so powerful. To see so much civil rights history there, so many heroes. I got to visit the Equal Justice Initiative's Legacy Museum, which is just absolutely a world-class museum. So much work and dedication clearly went into making that what it is. But can you talk about your experience, I guess, being in the heart of that in your city, with all this history, with all these civil rights heroes around, these champions of voting rights and of their civil rights, how that's influenced you, or what your experience with that has been?
It's been invaluable. It's been a situation that I didn't always appreciate, certainly growing up. Appreciate a lot of those pearls of wisdom that I heard now kind of sitting around my parents' living room, some of the churches where different commemorations were held, and certainly even some of the boardrooms where there were discussions that were being had about how to continue the work that had been done decades prior. And I think that, for me, and maybe like others as well, you can take for granted some of those things that are closest to you, and some of those things that you just assume people know, and you assume people appreciate. And, that shaped my mindset, even in the corporate space. It shaped my mindset in the entrepreneurial space. And it shaped my mindset, once I entered the political space as well. And it was to try to advance, our cause for, fairness and justice for everyone in the country. And, I think that is something that is said a lot, but in actuality, it's not put into place. Often, again, we tend to fall back into those things that are comfortable to us, or those things that are expedient for us. And I think that hearing some of the lessons of names that but probably even more importantly, names that most people will never know, and what they did, why they did it, the risks they were taking, Black, white, young and old, men and women, all the way across the board. You come away with a sense of courage. You come away with a sense of fortitude that, for me, has steeled my resolve in making decisions, not only as mayor, but even as probate judge. When I think back to that time, and I really appreciated serving on the standards board and working with the EAC, it's a time that I really treasure, because I learned a lot as a probate judge. One of the more challenging times was around the same-sex marriage battle and the legalization of that, and whether or not we were going to stand for the rule of law in spite of what might have been political opposition. And it turned out to be very strong political opposition. Well, I was the first probate judge to do that in the state of Alabama. And that was after the Supreme Court decision. And so when I thought about whether or not to make the decision to stand to our Chief Justice of our Supreme Court, I literally thought back to judges like Frank M. Johnson. And I thought back to so many attorneys like Attorney Fred Gray, who represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. I thought about Attorney Clifford Durr, a white attorney who was very instrumental, and his wife Virginia, very, very instrumental at that time in helping protesters get in and out of jail, and bailing out the leaders such as Ralph Abernathy, and I thought about the courage that it took then. And I kind of said to myself, well, you think about what they had to deal with, and you think about the tension and the trauma that they had seen throughout that time, and they still marched on, they still pressed on. So for me, it became one of those points of, well, you have to do this, because what you're dealing with in this challenge is nothing compared to what many people in various positions dealt with in decades past. And I think being aware of that history helped me then, and it continues to help me now as we deal with other challenges around our elections process, as we deal with challenges around voting rights, as we deal with challenges around election integrity and the question of that shrouded in the belief of transparency, but when it's really guided by other things. And so, you know, I think that for us, we have to continue to remember that, you know, the march for freedom in this country has never been short. It has never been a direct line. It has never been a smooth transition. It has always been something that has presented, you know, very strong pushback. But what we realize in knowing the history of the civil rights movement and those that participated in it is that they always marched on. They went back to the drawing board and they planned and they executed. They went back to the drawing board and they went to court. They went back to the drawing board and they tried to pass legislation. And so we have to understand that that's part of the history. It's not all summed up in a John Lewis quote around good trouble. It's not always summed up in even just the discussions around the Freedom Riders or a speech Dr. King gave in this place or somewhere else. It is really summed up in the collective action of that. And I think for me, that's the thing that I take away from, you know, being in this place called Montgomery, Alabama, and being on these steps of really, you know, trailblazers and people that change history for the betterment of everyone, even ways that they could not foresee at that time. And to hear some of them still tell stories about the Montgomery bus boycott and around the sit-in movement and around these events and the things that happen in between only further my resolve to do what I can as mayor to bring about more equality and equity, not only in our city, but hopefully be a blueprint for the state and for the rest of the nation.
Great. That's a great transition to the next question that I have. What does Black History Month mean to you, Mayor?
Wow, it's special. You know, started by Dr. Carter G. Woodson, it's Negro History Week to highlight the achievements of Black people at a time when they didn't rarely, or they didn't acknowledge them hardly at all. And we think about that being the birth month of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, which is why it is in February, only for it to go to Black History Month under President Ford. It's important for us to understand it in context. And the context is that this is a time to highlight it. And this is a time to amplify those achievements. But that doesn't mean that the other 11 months of the year are not times for us to continue to work towards what those history makers were doing and had to overcome or accomplish themselves. And so for me, it's a very special time to you know, challenge myself and to challenge others that I'm in contact with about the lessons that we take away from Black history, whether it was a Jackie Robinson, a Thurgood Marshall, whether it is those that made history throughout other times in this country's life. You know, Black history to me really comes down to connecting it to the American history and connecting it to the tissue of this nation and making sure that people understand that even though they may not be aware of what some of the challenges may have been, whether it was a Sojourner Truth or whether it was a Wilma Rudolph, whether it was a Ruby Bridges, you know, regardless of who those history makers were, it's important that we acknowledge that, we reflect on it, and that we learn from it. And I think that what we have come to do, unfortunately, is we've come to focus on what is viral as opposed to what is vital. And just one change of a letter, but a tremendous difference. Viral is something that is here for a minute, and we probably have forgotten its impact within 24 hours. Something that viral lives on because it's much deeper, even if it's not as broad. And I think when we consider the notion around Black History Month, in particular with elections, we have to understand that there were elections that were not always guaranteed. There were elections that were not always promised, not only to women, but to Black women, to Black men who had voting rights and then had them taken away after Reconstruction. So it's important for us to talk about, yes, there were achievements, but some of those achievements were rolled back. And right now we would read the history book and we could say, well, how was that allowed to happen? Or some of us would say, well, that could never happen now. But when we think about being in the shadows of the Equal Justice Initiative's Memorial for Peace and Justice that is right here in Montgomery, Alabama, and we think about those lynchings that took place, and we think about some of those lynchings taking place because people wanted and demanded their right to vote when it was legally granted to them by the federal government, but not recognized by the state government. That is a powerful lesson. It is a powerful and painful lesson for us to remember as it relates to Black History Month. And so while we certainly want to remember and recognize those achievements and those highlights in American history, we have to also recognize during Black History Month the challenges and the obstacles and the evils that also resonated during Black History Month as it relates to progress that was being made and the obstacles that had to be overcome by many in this country only because of the color of their skin. And so as we extrapolate that in a more diverse, more multiracial, multicultural America, we have to make sure that we're balancing that recognition and we're balancing how we tell the story of Black history in this country. And we acknowledge that certainly there were always allies that were not Black that helped move this nation forward, that helped move Black Americans and African Americans forward at different times, but there were painful challenges. And we have to make sure that we remember those lessons as well, and we carry those forward so that we can make sure when we see some signs of that, and we see some regression where that is concerned, that we press pause and we push stop to make sure that we aren't repeating those same instances of history. And so I hope that Black History Month to others means what it means to me, and that is the significance and the achievements certainly that Black Americans have contributed to our society, but also to learn the pains and lessons and obstacles that also have been a part of this society as well, so that we can continue to make our nation better and live up to its full potential.
You mentioned, Mayor Reed, the idea of things being vital, and certainly, a vital part of our democracy is encouraging people to vote, encouraging people to participate in the process, continue to stay engaged. Can you talk a little bit about how, as mayor, you've encouraged residents of Montgomery to participate in the voting process, and either, how that's changed since your role as probate judge, or how that maybe has informed the work that you're doing now?
Absolutely. It ties in because as probate judge, what we try to do as a chief election official in Montgomery County, in the place where the voting rights march ended from Selma to Montgomery, we thought it was very important to try to increase participation in the voting process and to try to year-round, and even more so than just that, every day try to educate people on the importance of voting and why it mattered. And that was something that we tried to do in the probate judge's office, and it's something that we have tried to carry over to the mayor's office to increase voter outreach, to increase voter education. So it's not just around election time, but we're talking about civics, and we're explaining the importance of the election process. We're talking about our democracy and being a republic. what does all that mean? And so if it is a contest over here with a group of school children, or if it is something we're doing with a civic group, we try to partner to uplift the election process and educate our community, because again, even here, people can become complacent. They can become even skeptical of their the impact of voting, and we try to remind them without beating them over the head in a negative sense, but we try to encourage and inspire them to vote because of what is possible. And so I share some of those elections that were decided by votes that I can count on my hand. I share some of those outcomes that were decided, in very close margins at federal levels. And we talk about all of those things, and we say that, hey, this is where we're all equal when we all get, the same representation. That's one person for one vote. And so we try to do those things to encourage participation in the process, and also to educate and inform our residents about elections themselves and things that bodies like the EAC does on our behalf that people rarely hear about and may not always appreciate unless they're told. So we try to share some of that information too.
Mayor Reed, I want to thank you for taking your time today to join us to talk with you about your history and the history of your city. I think of three great cities, Boston, Philadelphia, and Montgomery, as cities that have led the charge in changing the outcome of our nation and making things better. So it's always a pleasure, and we particularly appreciate you sharing those points and the work that you've done with the EAC and the work recognizing Black History Month. So continue your work, and if we can be of any help in the future, please let us know. Thank you.
Thomas and Ben, thank you all so much for your leadership, and thank you for your service to this nation. And it truly, truly is a great opportunity to talk with you all once again. I know the work that you put in over the years, and you continue to put in now on behalf of election integrity, on behalf of election assistance at the federal, state, and local level. And I just want you all to know that as a mayor in a different post, if there's any way that I can ever help and be of assistance, I'd love to do that, because it's so important what you're doing and the work that you all continue to bring forth in Washington to our lawmakers and decision makers, that any way that we can support, we want to do that as well. But thanks so much for everything that you do.
Thank you. Great to talk to you today.
Great to talk to you.
Yes, sir. Same here.